But for you also, I mean, I guess you were always after perfection, weren't you? I mean, striving towards perfection in sound. So something like the CD is actually a blessing to you.
To me it is, yes. I mean, it has, with the improvements that have gone on within it. Because with analogue tape, the master of, for example, Dark Side of the Moon, there is only one.
Yeah.
There is a master. It is now over 40 years old, or just about 40 years old. It's a piece of magnetic tape that runs at 15 inches per second. And every crossfade that happens between tracks, which is well known about, that is a copy of the end of one song and the beginning of another song with other stuff laid over onto it. And then you snip the piece out and you edit it into the ending of the first song and into the beginning of the next song onto a convenient invisible point where you can't hear it. And that's your crossfade. And so there's a whole one side one and a whole side two, as it was in those wonderful days of vinyl. But the tape, if you look at it, is a mass of little pieces of editing tape. Yeah. You know, the little sticky, it's like sellotape, but very, very thin, very fine. And if you watch it playing, there's all these tons of little white dots keep going through on that original one tape. And over the years, with some qualities of magnetic tape, the glue that holds what is basically iron filings, you know, magnetic tape is very, very microscopic particles of metal glued onto a piece of plastic tape. And if the glue is not particularly long-lasting, you can have that falling apart. And also, the glue on the sticky tape that you use to join bits together, the editing tape, that can start failing and falling apart. And you find yourself having to, for one thing, with lots of old tapes, there's a particular series of tapes from a particular time, which you have to bake in an oven. You have to put the whole tape, a great big reel of tape, in an oven and bake it to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time to reseal the glue. And also you have to take some of the edits apart and rejoin them together with newer editing tape. So it's a very, very fragile, very old, fragile thing, the original master, which is why most people, most record companies want to work in a different medium. And in the days of tape, that meant making production masters or copy masters. There's a copy master and a production master. It's hard to explain the difference, but I mean, tapes would be sent out all over the world, which are copies or production masters, to make the stampers that they make the actual discs with. And there are so many places within that procedure where something can go wrong. You know, if the room which you are making your mother or your master stamper, if there's dust in the air, you get one piece speck of dust in a groove and you're going to have a click that lasts on that record forever. So every single stamper has to be examined and listened to carefully all the way through to make certain there's no little tiny errors on it.
But I can remember in the past you've said, talking about Islamic art, for example, that, you know, the idea of the little imperfection that makes the ultimate beauty, or that kind of thing.
There's plenty of Islamic errors in the actual recording of the music without having to need them to be in the actual physical object that gets played.
Fair enough. And how about those kind of almost like nostalgic things of, you know, of the clicks and the hiss and is that not part of the atmosphere of a record? Or
there are people who have put artificial hiss on records, to make things sound. You know, the lo-fi is what the lo-fi movement is partly about, I guess.
What they actually put artificial hiss on?
Yeah. I mean, original tape hiss was the devil in the old days. We tried our very, very best to eliminate tape hiss, and to do that you have to record as loudly onto the tape as you can, so that the basic inherent noise of tape is kept to the minimum. That's called the signal-to-noise ratio.
Okay, right.
The Dolby unit was made to encode music onto tape in such a way that it used the maximum of the tape all the way through, so that you had the minimum of tape hiss and therefore a better signal to noise ratio.
It's quite funny actually, the vinyl movement, isn't it, in a way, because you're saying all the 100 years of recorded music, they've been trying to perfect it, and now there's a movement saying, oh, well, no, we liked it the way it was.
Yes, I appreciate people's nostalgia for this stuff, but in my mind, the modern digital technology is better, or as good as vinyl can be, and is so much more reliable in terms of getting your stuff out at as high a quality as it can be throughout the world.
Tell me though, obviously as you were saying before, it depends on the system. So things like, I don't know much about this, but amplifiers using valves instead of transistors and so on, this is all...
Well, I don't know that much. I mean, I don't know enough about that to give you a proper answer, but needless to say, I use valve amps.
Right.
And in the industry, pretty well, it's all valve amps.
And
in the top sort of studios.
Do you know why does that create a better sound?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not. I have no real idea. I guess it's quite probable that it doesn't anymore, and that I'm just a little old-fashioned myself and haven't been keeping up with the technology of the very. I mean, undoubtedly transistors or whatever they are these days have improved vastly over the years, and perhaps they are just as good these days. I don't know. I
suppose one thing about the CD, and I find this with the internet, is on one hand it's great, nothing's ever finished, you can always go back to it. I mean, I'm talking about the net now. On the other hand, it's dreadful because nothing's ever finished, you can always go back to it. And digital, I mean, you've got your bonus tracks, you know, you can go back in and remaster all the time, presumably between pressings, and I mean, is that it leaves the work never quite completely finished. Do you agree?
For me, I made my last album on an island, and there was a point where it was finished.
Right.
And that was pretty much the end of it. What then happens about putting other bits into various different packages of the way it's all done these days is sort of moves slightly out of my hands. People come to me with suggestions of what they do, and I say yes or no. But my job is to get the record actually finished. And as you say, you can piss around with it forever and ever, changing tiny little things, correcting tiny little imperfections as you see them, or creating little imperfections deliberately until it's finished.
Because actually, properly. Now that you keep remastering it, is it actually better than it was, in your opinion? Are there things you brought out that weren't on the original?
Well, the remaster, the remaster is working from that original master tape, and there's a limit. No, there's a limit to what you can do in remastering. Basically, you can change levels a little bit. Yeah. So if there are quieter bits you want to raise a bit, you can do that, and you change the EQ, the treble and bass. And there's treble and bass in a studio is. There are 100 trebles, 100 middles, 100 basses, and you're picking out individual little frequencies and subtracting some and adding some by tiny, tiny bits to make it sound as good as it possibly can. And, of course, using the latest digital equipment to make it as good as it possibly can be, if you're doing it digitally.
But then, of course, it still depends on the transmitting equipment, doesn't it?
Yeah. The weakest link is the weakest link.
I remember that. I remember what my final, well, it wasn't a question, more of a topic, is that you weren't the only ones, but certainly the first, probably in Britain, and the first to take it out of an intellectual atmosphere of, music concrete and all that, and using found sounds and so on. And this is the place where it really came to the fore, didn't it?
Yes.
And I suppose that'd be one reason why you're looking for perfection all the time, rather, you're
looking for perfection, but that is all to create an atmosphere, to fool the senses into thinking you're somewhere that you're not. You're trying to create a different world and convince the listener that they are in a different world, and you use any found sounds, any bits of bird song, tractors, industrial engines, anything to try to create a place where you can take people out of the moment they are in and put them in a different place. The same as happens if you read a book. The thing in Wish You Were Here with the lift and stuff was a very carefully created piece of sound collage to make it sound like someone was going into a lift, going up a little lift and coming out in a party. All entirely created with machinery that was synthesized stuff, but it's quite cleverly done. That on some sort of scale was the way we were thinking all the time through these albums.
Right, yeah, because I remember the first time I ever heard that. I mean, it just seemed extraordinary to me, that you managed to bring the outside world, not just instruments, but the whole world into this thing, and give it out again.
Well, that's the part of the joy of listening to it, is, the kind of shutting your eyes and being transported to a different place.
Yeah. And
which is why other things have helped.
And did you know that you were sitting on this enormous
we all knew that we were...
This was going to lift it to an even bigger...
Yes, this was a pinnacle that we were going towards. Obviously, you never have any real idea of... no one is ever going to think that, or maybe everyone thinks, but I suspect that everyone doesn't thinks that it's not going to be the longest album on the charts ever, and other of those sort of grand award type things that it has achieved.
Put it this way, you knew it was big, obviously. Yeah. Did you know how big it was going to be?
No, big for us would have been a #1 album of any sort.
Right. And so this...
Disappearing without trace after 3 months,
How about, not so much the artifact as the work? Some albums are collections of songs.
Yeah.
Some albums probably come from a unified perspective to start with, and some kind of gather unity around them.
Yeah.
So, was Dark Side... concept album seems the wrong name, but I don't know if it was ever called a concept album, was it?
I don't think we ever called it a concept album, but it has its negative feelings a little bit these days, but it's a perfectly good description.
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't worry about too much. That is a deliberately cohesive story in that album, which is giving Roger's view on various aspects of life condensed into one 45 minutes long thing. As you say, other albums can come along which, because of the mood you're in at the time you're making it, they are a snapshot of a moment of a person's or a band's life.
Yeah.
And so there's often going to be a kind of consistency of mood about them, which if you, when you're making it, recognise and emphasise a little bit more, you can get something that may not be what you'd call a concept album, but it has a sort of consistency.
So one might say that about On an Island, say.
Yes.
It's all come from one place, and one mood, and one...
But that is distinctly a bunch of songs, but at the same time, to me, it has a distinct mood, and it is, like I say, a snapshot of that moment.
But if one were to take, say, a Beatles album, an early one, Hard Day's Night, that's a collection of songs, isn't it?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Well, that's a film soundtrack.
Well, that's true. Okay, let's try another one.
But with the Beatles,
well,
yes.
It's just a collection of songs.
But again, it's not a concept album, but it has a very distinct sound, and the way they were making it, which is going straight into a studio, put the mics on the kit and everything, and record the song. The first Beatles album, I think, was done in, 17 hours, was it?
And does that actually have a bearing on the unity of an album? How much studio time you've booked? Clearly not at your stage because you've got your own studio. But
no, I don't really think so.
You don't say okay, we're booked in for 2 months and we're going to do an album there, and then that produces the unity, if you see what I mean.
Well, that happens all the time, yes,
with
all sorts of people. There are obviously limits to the amount of time, which is very expensive studio time.
Yeah. And so on Dark Side, though, because it started as Eclipse?
I guess. It was its first name as a complete piece was Eclipse. Yeah.
Oh, okay, right. And
it was still being called Eclipse, I think, when we performed it live at the Rainbow in '72.
And did you and Roger and the guys say this? I mean, did you all know it was intended as a piece of work?
Yes. I mean, it was clear from pretty much from the outset that Roger had a series of ideas that he wanted to explore.
Right. And there'd been metal in between, but you had come out of a kind of orchestral thing, hadn't you, as well?
Well, we'd come out of a period of, in my mind, slightly floundering around for a while during Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother, and being experimental to try and find our feet, really, to find where we would get moving to, which I think we did find by Medal.
Yeah.
I mean, Medal was really, really good moments and shows quite clearly the way forward, with Echoes particularly.
Yeah. So, but you all knew you were working on a piece.
Yes.
For a Dark Side.
On an album of songs which would be interlinked and physically and mentally.
And then how about the ordering? Was there a logic of lyric or...?
Well, towards the end there is a logic.
Yeah.
But yes, the beginning and the end both have a logic of the time elapsing. I suppose one or two of the pieces in the middle could be interchanged if you wanted to.
Right. And so you had these songs and you kind of knew pretty much which order they would run in anyway?
More or less,
does that depend? Again, that, obviously I can tell you go loud, soft, slow, fast. You're trying to pitch it to make
I don't think we ever did any of that.
Really?
Moon. I don't think there was any concern about fast, slow, loud, soft. I think the songs just took their own shapes, and I mean, to be honest, I can't really remember how the final order was achieved. As I say, in the middle of the thing, because you could have swapped Money and Us and Them if you wanted to, in terms of its of the logic of the whole piece. Roger might say that's bullshit. I don't know.
But that's interesting, because I just assumed that even if one had this kind of unity of idea, that you then went in rather like a DJ and created mood to, bring people up, take people down, bring them up again, and see them out.
Well, there have been moments when you attempt to do that in the sequencing of albums. You do some of that. You decide what is going to be the best song to close with, the best song to open with, and that may have not anything to do with the lyrical content of those things. But with Dark Side of the Moon and other of our albums, Wish You Were Here, that wasn't really a consideration.
So I'm assuming on an island, that was a consideration, yes? To have a suite of songs that kind of carry you through from one end to the next.
Yes. A lot of time is spent considering the sequence that those songs are going to run in.
Yeah. And now there is one disadvantage of the CD, surely, that it's too easy to skip.
Oh, even vinyl is easy enough to skip.
I suppose so, yeah.
To the detriment of your albums, if you weren't very careful.
I hadn't realised that, because I just, from what I've read and so on, I'd assume that there are loose ends at the beginning of an end of any album, and I was saying that thing about Dogs, which started for You Were Here, didn't it, or was around that time, but actually ended up on another album.
Yes, what became Dogs, which was originally called You Ought to Be Crazy, and what became Shine On You Crazy Diamond were written sort of at the same time, in a rehearsal room in King's Cross.
Yeah, I suppose one has to understand as well there's a kind of organic production to these things, that you don't go in there saying, okay, this is going to be this song about this, and it's going to fit in that. It all comes together quite slowly in the creative process, I suppose.
Yes, Dogs, or You Got to Be Crazy, was a song that I felt at the time should have been on the Wish You Were Here album, and Roger and I had some heated discussion about it, and the decision was to not put it on that album and use it later for something and make Shine On be the beginning and the ending of the Wish You Were Here album, with other things within it which were more relevant to the thing. He was entirely right, I was entirely wrong. It's not the first time.
And how about this thing then? So if we have an album like Dark Side, as opposed to a collection of songs, although you were saying that's not necessarily true. The merits and rewards of listening to it from beginning to end, you know.
That was how it was designed, but that was also much more the sort of thing that was the general way one did it.
Well, this is, yeah.
I mean, one would sit around with some friends in a room with as high quality a system as you could, and you would join together in sharing that experience amongst you, and that was what it was intended for.
Yeah.
But that was the way it tended to be. Now, of course, everyone is individually listening with tiny headphones to different things to everyone else, and it's a shame to lose that joined experience,
well,
the
also,
common experience.
and the length of that experience, because, you know, I mean, in Britain, for example, you only did one single, didn't you? Well, apart from the SID singles. You know, it was considered that there was the 3-minute or 5-minute track had not very much merit compared to the...
Well, it moved you into a slightly different world,
yeah,
which we had doubts about whether we wanted to move into. And we had a sort of fairly clear idea of the way we wanted to operate as a musical ensemble. And that was to go and do an experience which enveloped you for 2 hours or whatever. And the records were the same thing. It's something that demands a greater concentration for a span of time. And we wanted, not force, but to encourage people to take the time to enjoy the whole experience, to listen to the whole thing through, hear its cohesiveness, how one thing moved to another thing, how the ideas in the lyrics related backwards and forwards throughout it. And
well,
it was a grander idea of popular music, if you like, but unashamedly so.
Do you think that's disappearing or disappeared? Or?
It's not disappeared. I'm sure people are still trying to do it, but I mean, I don't. In musicians' intentions, I don't think it's entirely disappeared. But I don't know how or where people actually do that same thing of actually sitting around in a room for a whole sort of hour or whatever it is, and listening to one body of work. I mean, for me, there just never seems to be time.
Although you said you did it yourself with On an Island and with Polly
with
about a month ago,
yeah.
That was the anniversary.
Yes, it must have been about the anniversary, but yes, we just felt like the right moment to have a listen to it, and it was fantastic. I couldn't have enjoyed it more, but I remember at the same time when we finished it, and it had that cohesion to it, or we had attempted to make it have that cohesion, and we sat and listened to it here in this room, and it did, to me.
Because that's the other thing, is that, as you were just saying, you get these lyrical and musical references between tracks, don't you? That are meant to hold the thing together, and which get stripped out when you listen individually, and so presumably diminish the experience.
Well, diminish, yes, or leave you. Diminish is one way of saying it, but you could just say it was just leaves you short of the maximum you could get out of it.
Yeah, I suppose it's not just technology; it's a million things and fractured society, but we seem to have less common things that we do together anymore, don't we?
That's right. I listened to Brain Damage the other day, and I was thinking how brilliant the lyrics were to that, focusing in on one track just because it happened to come on somewhere. It is a great piece of work.
When's the last time you listened to Dark Side from the Union?
God, sometime in the last few years we have done a quad remix of Dark Side of the Moon, and we've put out various remasters and various things, and each time we have one of those, it is my job to sit down and listen to it very carefully. With a professional ear, which can sometimes take away from the emotional experience. But I think that within the last year or so I have listened to it.